This presentation is based on information gleaned from the records assembled by members of the Lincoln Quilters Guild during the Nebraska Quilt Project, which they initiated in 1985. Quilters and community leaders across the state joined them in photographing and recording information about Nebraska quilts. Because of their efforts, we know a great deal more today about Nebraska Quiltmakers and their quilts than we did 20 years ago. What led them to undertake this enormous statewide project? Several factors motivated them, but the most compelling was their concern that many surviving 19th and early 20th century quilts in private hands were being sold to dealers and collectors outside the state at an astonishing rate. While the quilts remained in family hands, knowledge of the quilt's history, who made it, when it was made, and where it was made, was generally preserved. However, when family quilts were sold to dealers from California, New York, and elsewhere, this historical information was usually forever lost. So in an effort to preserve this information and to help compile information about Midwestern quilt-making traditions, the Lincoln Quilters Guild spearheaded the Nebraska Quilt Project, and citizens across the state joined them in the effort. Eventually, the Nebraska Quilt Project Committee documented nearly 5,000 quilts and 3,000 makers. The book, Nebraska Quilts and Quiltmakers, is one of the outcomes of that effort and is now in its third printing. The information that we uncovered in the statewide survey is fascinating, especially the stories of some of the individual makers and the quilts they made. Their stories shed light on the lives of women from the mid-19th to the mid-20th century, and so I'd like to share a few of them with you. The oldest surviving quilt known to have been made by a Nebraskan is an applique quilt completed by Martha Alice in 1860. Martha was born in the Missouri River settlement of Bellevue in 1840. Her parents were among the earliest European settlers in the state. They were Presbyterian missionaries to the Pawnee Indians. Martha's parents actually arrived before Nebraska became one of the United States. They arrived when this part of the western frontier was still called the Nebraska Territory. Nebraska did not gain its statehood until 1867, nearly 7 years after this quilt was made by Martha. Her quilt is a variation of the pattern called Wreath of Roses. It's one of the red and green applique quilts that were a favored quilt style in America between the 1840s and 1870s. Applique quilts are much more challenging and time-consuming to make than most pieced block-style quilts. Martha's applique quilt of red and green calico shows that frontier families secured fashionable fabrics from traders, even in remote western territories, and made quilts just like those being made in eastern states during the same period. Although Martha's quilt was made in Nebraska in 1860, few other Nebraska-made quilts were found that were believed to have been made before 1870. Most surviving Nebraska quilts documented in the statewide survey were made between 1890 and 1940, or after 1970. This isn't surprising, for the 1870s and 1880s were the decades when most European settlers arrived in Nebraska, so naturally most Nebraska quilts would be made after that time. Many of the quilt makers or their parents came to Nebraska following the Civil War, when a wave of Civil War veterans came west to seek land and fortunes. This wave of migration populated the remaining western territories, as depicted in this contemporary quilt entitled The Promise. While many were homesteaders, many more purchased land from railroads. The railroads mounted an advertising campaign in the eastern United States and Europe during the 1870s that would rival sophisticated marketing efforts today. They produced pamphlets touting Nebraska as a place rich with, quote, the promise of agricultural rewards, and hence the title for this quilt. Traveling exhibits and promotional lectures followed to reinforce the image. This promotional effort was hugely successful. Large settlements of Germans, English, Swedes, Danes, and Czechs formed colonies and purchased railroad land in Nebraska as a result of the railroad advertising effort. One aspect of Nebraska's quilt making practices that was particularly striking to me was that quilt making was a lifelong activity, and the hardships of relocation and settlement did not interrupt their quilt making activities for long, if at all. For example, Sophia Heinrichs and her daughter Helena made a quilt while living under some of the most unfavorable conditions I can imagine during homesteading years. They pieced this fan quilt while living in a dugout, which remained their home for more than 5 years. Can you imagine making a quilt when struggling to make a home under these conditions? Or these? Sitting a homestead claim in the sandhills of northwestern Nebraska seems an unlikely setting for stitching a lavish silk crazy quilt like this. But according to her memoirs, Clarissa Griswold stitched this quilt from a variety of silk fabrics sent to her by her family, who remained in Minnesota. In her memoirs, Clarissa recalls how in her youth, her imagination was fired by stories of young people finding their fortunes in the West, and of girlfriends homesteading together in a cabin built on adjoining claims. In 1885, she lived out her dream. A friend invited Clarissa to visit her home in Ainsworth to see the West and to recover her health after 3 years of teaching elementary school. Clarissa arrived in September of 1885, and hearing of land and opportunities further west, she went on to Valentine. In October, she staked a claim sight unseen near what was to be Harrison, Nebraska. After wintering in Denver with an uncle, Clarissa made the journey back to Nebraska by train, stagecoach, and wagon, chaperoned only by her revolver. She had a log cabin built for her, rare in Nebraska, but as a relatively well-to-do single woman, she was able to buy supplies and to hire the necessary work to be done, including having a log cabin built for her. Clarissa's life was very different from that of most homesteading women. With no livestock or family to tend, she had time to paint flowers on silk patches and make this crazy quilt. Incidentally, Clarissa married Dwight Griswold, whom she had met at her friend's home when she first came to Nebraska, and the second of their 3 children, Dwight Griswold Jr., later became governor of Nebraska and a U.S. senator. While the homesteading circumstances of these women provide some sharp contrasts, nevertheless, the making of both quilts illustrate how quickly women resumed quilt making after their move to a new home and to a life that was by no means easy. What motivated women to devote so many spare moments to quilt making, even under the most adverse circumstances? The majority of Nebraska quilt makers indicated that they began quilt making because it was a pastime that they enjoyed. It allowed them to escape the rigors and drabness of their everyday routines and enter a world of color and create something of beauty for their home. Although some quilt making was done primarily to provide warm bedding during hard times, a lot of quilt making was done for the sheer pleasure and joy of creating an object of beauty. Some quilts, like this applique quilt, are so complex and the needlework so fine that it's clear the quilt maker did not hastily assemble them to provide warm bedding. The number of hours required to complete this exquisite floral applique quilt is almost beyond reckoning. There are more than 800 tiny, near-perfect red circles alone, as well as all the yellow centers, countless leaves, and yards of slender, trailing vine. Louise Sur started this quilt in 1894 and completed it during the first year of her marriage. Marie spent most of her life on a farm near Staplehurst, where she and her husband raised 12 children, 4 of whom were born in the first 5 years of their marriage. It's a good thing she completed the quilt during that first year, I think. Another quilt that stands as powerful evidence that women derive great personal satisfaction from creating beautiful quilts and showing off their exceptional needlework skills is Grace Schneider's quilt called Flower Basket Petty Point. While it does not hold the world's record for the most pieces, it comes close. It boasts over 87,000 pieces. The pieces are smaller than a postage stamp, approximately a 1/2 inch to 5/8 inch squares. Grace Schneider, author of the familiar autobiography No Time on My Hands, devoted 16 months to making this quilt during World War II. It was the Purple Sweepstakes winner at the Nebraska State Fair in 1944. Grace Schneider's quilts, and others like it, for example, this stunning Mariner's Compass, illustrate that quilt making was not undertaken simply to meet family needs. Certainly pioneer values of resourcefulness and industriousness motivated women to devote their free time to quilt making and other forms of needlework, but necessity was clearly not their only or even primary motivation for making a quilt such as this one. Another example of impressive quilt making skills is this star quilt. Perhaps the remarkable amount of time devoted to quilt making by rural American women during the 19th and 20th centuries is better explained by the limited opportunities for artistic expression available to rural women and men, especially those settling the frontier. Painting, sculpture, and other fine arts were regarded as far too frivolous for rural women or men to undertake. On the other hand, quilt making, which produced a useful item for their families, afforded women an acceptable avenue for their creativity. From the numbers of outstanding quilts that have survived, it's clear that women exercised this option. They had other reasons for quilt making as well. Some women found quilt making therapeutic. Ellen Maxwell made this crazy quilt to overcome grief following the death of her baby daughter from diphtheria during an epidemic during the winter of 1892. She sank into a deep depression, and her husband became so concerned that he sought the help of his neighbors, an elderly couple who had lost their only child many years before. The wife thought that making a quilt might help Ellen through her grief, and so she offered to bring over some fabric scraps and to show her how to piece. According to Ellen's granddaughter, Grandma Maxwell got hold of her life again and finished the quilt and folded it up and put it away. And because it was never used, the quilt remained in pristine condition. Special occasions, more joyous ones, such as birthdays, graduations, marriages, and births, prompted a great deal of quilt making in all periods. For example, Rachel Armstrong Chase made this handsome applique quilt of indigo blue cottons in 1874 for the dowry of her daughter, Sarah Parrott. The Parrotts were early settlers of Albion, Nebraska. And this striking crazy quilt was made in Creighton, Nebraska by a mother for her son's 12th birthday. We know this because the inscription in pink and green embroidery reads, "A present to Ernest on his 12th birthday, 1899, Mama." Alice Dorr was a skilled seamstress. Unfortunately, Ernest died in a mining accident in Colorado at age 21. The family cherished the quilt as a reminder of Ernest. And this quilt, with an appliqued message, was a going-away gift for a young man, William Hutchison, who was leaving his home in West Virginia for unknown Nebraska in 1882. Quilts with messages are very rare, and fewer still carry a message of such length and of such a cautionary nature as this one made by William's grandmother. It reads in part, "Attend, young friend, while I relate the dangers you are in, the evils that around you wait while subject unto sin. Well, turn to the Lord, forsake all sin, and He'll forgive what's past." And she ends with the date, 1882. And here's the photo of the young man with his bride on their wedding day. So the grandmother's worst fears did not materialize, fortunately. Members of the Ladies' Aid Society of the Wahoo Presbyterian Church made this quilt to raise money for their minister's salary. They charged their friends, family members, and neighbors 10 cents for the right to have their name embroidered on a block, and then sold the quilt at auction. Many of the early settlers of the Wahoo area have their signatures among the 300 names embroidered in radiating spokes that suggest wagon wheels. Among the names was that of a young lawyer and magnetic orator from Lincoln who had spoken at different functions in Wahoo on a number of occasions. Apparently, he was also asked to buy a right to have his name on the quilt, for Colonel William Jennings Bryan and Mrs. Bryan both did so. Bryan was a colonel for less than a year during the brief Spanish-American War of 1898. Soon after, he became an avowed pacifist and never used the title again. Also included in one wheel were all names are Native American, including Wallace Whitehorse and Les Yellowfish. Were they members of the congregation, friends of one of the quilt makers, or a friend of the minister? We'll never know, but it documents the participation of both settlers and Native Americans in this quilt making and fundraising tradition. So, for a variety of reasons and for a variety of occasions, women made many quilts. But we wondered when and how did they learn to quilt? Some women learned to make quilts as children, because in rural households, children as well as adolescents were expected to participate in the household work of their families. Young girls of the 19th and early 20th century were much more likely to learn to sew as a way to prepare for their future lives than are children and adolescents today. Many Nebraska quilt makers related stories about their childhood experiences in quilt making. Belle Frazier of Parks, Nebraska, the youngest quilt maker registered in this statewide survey, started this quilt when she was 3.5 years old. It was a simple 4-patch, just little squares, as she described it. My mother would cut them out and pin them together and mark where I was supposed to sew. While some quilt makers were like Belle Sims Frazier and began to quilt as children under their mother's close supervision, the majority of Nebraska quilt makers in all periods began to make quilts as young adults. Many young women made their first quilts for their dowries, as did Helen Chalupnik, the 14-year-old girl who made this quilt. Another question of interest to us was, did most Nebraska quilt makers quilt in groups or alone? We found that nearly 2/3 of the quilts registered in the Nebraska Quilt Project were quilted by the quilt maker herself rather than by someone else or in quilting bees. A number of quilt makers indicated that they didn't want careless hands to spoil their prized work, and so they quilted their heirloom quilts themselves. And so we discovered that most Nebraska quilt makers did not quilt their quilts at the quilting bee, so often pictured in novels and movies or paintings such as this. We suspect that most quilts quilted at quilting bees were quilts made for fundraising or mission purposes, and those were rarely registered in this survey. This special quilt, however, was made by a group, 44 friends and relatives, all members of the Thimble Club of Cairo, Nebraska. They helped Rosemary Seek make this friendship crazy quilt for her mother. The 15-year-old daughter embroidered the center block inscription, which reads, "Presented to Mama, the 21st of September, 1910. What a birthday present." Well, in conclusion, quilt making in Nebraska was a practice of thriftiness. It was a respected feminine pastime and an enduring form of self-expression. Nebraskans prided themselves in their industriousness, their frugality, and their resourcefulness. These values are clearly reflected in their quilt making. Although quilt making was no longer a fashionable activity for urban American women by the late 19th century, it remained a popular activity in Nebraska until the 1950s because most Nebraskans continued to live on farms and in small towns where traditional values continued to dominate family life and farm life. Well, that concludes this brief look back at a century of quilts in women's lives in Nebraska. If you would like to read more of their stories, pick up a copy of Nebraska Quilts and Quiltmakers at your local bookstore or public library. A copy of Nebraska Quilts and Quiltmakers was donated to every public library in the state by the Nebraska State Quilters Guild, and that's another indication of the grassroots support for quilt making in this state. Incidentally, in closing, let me acknowledge that one of the major reasons we now have the International Quilt Study Center at the University of Nebraska, and soon will have a quilt museum in Lincoln, is that Artis and Robert James, our benefactors, were impressed by Nebraska's strong grassroots support for what they envisioned in a quilt study center. They knew that Nebraska had a strong quilt-making tradition and must have a group of dedicated quilters to conduct such a successful statewide documentation project, culminating in a publication of an award-winning book. And so, we are the beneficiaries of their generosity.